The humidity in the suburbs of Virginia during July is the kind of heavy that sticks to your skin like a guilty conscience. I remember sitting on the porch swing, the chain groaning rhythmically under my weight, watching the fireflies dance over the overgrown lawn of the house I'd spent 12 years trying to turn into a home. Inside, the muffled sounds of the evening news hummed through the screen door, a background noise to the absolute silence that had grown between Mark and me. We were the classic American success story on paper: white picket fence, 2 SUVs in the driveway, and a 401k that looked healthy enough to retire on. But inside, it felt like we were two ghosts haunting the same hallways, passing each other with polite nods and the kind of, "How was your day?" that neither of us actually wanted an answer to. It's funny how you can live with someone for over a decade and still feel like a total stranger is sleeping 3 inches away from you. Then came the call from my sister, Sarah. She sounded frantic, the way she always does when her life in Chicago hits a snag. Her son, Leo, my nephew, had been caught up in some mess at his university. Nothing criminal, just the kind of academic burnout and social spiraling that happens when a 20-year-old kid realizes the world is bigger than a lecture hall. She wanted to know if he could stay with us for the summer. "Just to clear his head, Chloe," she'd pleaded. "He needs a change of scenery, away from the city, away from the pressure. You've always been the cool aunt. Maybe you can get through to him." I looked at Mark through the glass, seeing him slumped in his recliner, bathed in the blue light of the television, and I felt a sudden, desperate need for a third person in the house. I needed a buffer. I needed something, anything, to break the static of my marriage. I said yes before I even consulted my husband. When Leo pulled into the driveway 2 days later, I didn't recognize him. The last time I'd seen him, he was a gangly teenager with braces and a shy smile. The man who stepped out of that beat-up old sedan was someone else entirely. He was tall, his shoulders broad from whatever gym routine he'd picked up in college, with a jawline that could cut glass and eyes that seemed to see right through the polite veneer I worked so hard to maintain. He looked like his father, a man Sarah had divorced years ago, but with a softness around the mouth that was all Sarah. He gave me a half smile and a hug that felt a little too firm, a little too grounded for a nephew greeting his aunt. "Hey, Aunt Chloe," he said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that sent a strange, cold shiver down my spine. "Thanks for letting me crash. I know it's a lot." Mark was surprisingly okay with it. He liked the idea of having a guy's guy around to talk sports with, someone to help him with the yard work he'd been neglecting. For the first week, things were almost normal. Leo was quiet, helpful, and mostly kept to the guest room in the basement. But as the July heat intensified, so did the proximity. The house felt smaller with him in it. I started noticing things I shouldn't have noticed. The way the light hit the muscles in his back when he mowed the lawn without a shirt on. The scent of his cologne, something woody and sharp, that lingered in the hallway long after he'd gone for his morning run. I told myself it was just because he was new, a fresh face in a stale environment. I told myself I was just being maternal, looking out for him. But deep down, in that dark place we all have and never talk about, I knew I was looking at him the way a starving person looks at a feast. It wasn't just physical. Leo had this way of talking to me that made me feel visible again. Mark usually spent on dinners complaining about his boss at the firm or staring at his phone, but Leo would ask me questions, real questions. He wanted to know about my photography, the career I'd sidelined to support Mark's ambitions. He'd look at my old portfolios and actually see the art in them. "You have an eye for the things people usually miss, Chloe," he told me one night when we were cleaning up the kitchen. Mark had already gone to bed. "Most people just see the surface. You see the cracks, the beauty in the mess." He was standing close, leaning against the counter, and for a second, I forgot he was my sister's son. I forgot I was 41 and he was 20. I just saw a man who saw me. I felt a heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the Virginia summer. The tension started building like a storm on the horizon. I'd find myself lingering in the kitchen in my silk robe a little longer than necessary in the mornings, waiting for him to come up for coffee. I'd catch him watching me from across the living room, his gaze heavy and unreadable. There were moments, short, fleeting moments, where our hands would brush while passing a plate or a remote control, and the air would practically hum with static. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong. He was family. He was a guest. I was a married woman with a reputation and a life. But the more I tried to suppress it, the more it consumed my thoughts. I started having dreams, vivid, haunting dreams that left me waking up breathless and ashamed, glancing over at Mark's sleeping form with a mixture of guilt and resentment. One Saturday, Mark had to go into the city for a conference, leaving Leo and me alone for the weekend. The house felt cavernous without the familiar sound of Mark snoring or the clinking of his glass. Leo had spent the afternoon working on his car in the garage, and when he came in, he was covered in grease and sweat. He looked exhausted, but there was a raw, primal energy about him that made my pulse quicken. I offered to make him some iced tea, and as I handed him the glass, he didn't take it immediately. He looked at me, his eyes dark and searching. "You're unhappy, aren't you?" he asked bluntly. There was no judgment in his voice, just a simple, devastating observation. I tried to laugh it off, tried to give the standard, "Oh, marriage is hard" speech, but the words died in my throat. I couldn't lie to him, not then. I spent the rest of the evening trying to avoid him, but the house seemed to conspire against me. Every room I went into, he was there, or his presence was. His shoes by the door, his book on the coffee table. I decided to take a long, cold shower to clear my head, hoping to wash away the confusing swirl of emotions. I stayed under the water until my skin pruned, trying to convince myself that I was just bored, just lonely, and that this was all in my head. But when I stepped out and wrapped myself in a towel, the silence of the house felt heavy, like a held breath. I walked down the hall toward my bedroom, but as I passed the open door to the guest room, I stopped. I shouldn't have. I should have kept walking. But the door was cracked, and the light from the hallway spilled inside, illuminating the space just enough. Leo was asleep on top of the covers, the air conditioner humming loudly in the window. He was wearing nothing but a pair of loose gray sweatpants that had ridden low on his hips. He looked so peaceful, so different from the intense, brooding young man I saw during the day. But it was more than that. The sweatpants had shifted, and he was exposed, his body relaxed in the deep sleep of the young.
It was a sight that should have made me turn away in embarrassment, should have made me pull the door shut and run to my own room. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The air in the hallway felt thick, suffocatingly hot despite the AC. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a rhythmic pounding that drowned out everything else. In that moment, all the years of playing the good wife, the reliable sister, and the perfect aunt felt like a heavy coat I was desperate to shed. I looked at him, and I didn't see a nephew. I didn't see a kid in trouble. I saw a man who had woken up something in me that I thought had died a long time ago. My hand reached out for the doorframe, my knuckles white as I gripped the wood. I knew that if I took one step into that room, there would be no going back. The line I'd been walking so carefully for weeks was right there, invisible but absolute. I thought of Mark, of Sarah, of the life I'd built, and for a split second, they felt like shadows. The only thing that felt real was the heat radiating from that room and the sudden, overwhelming urge to stop being the woman everyone expected me to be. The transition from the hallway into the guest room felt like stepping through a portal into a different reality. My feet moved without my permission, the plush carpet muffling the sound of my steps as I drew closer to the edge of the bed. I told myself I was just going to close the door properly, or maybe pull the sheet over him so he wouldn't catch a chill from the window unit. But those were the lies we tell ourselves when we're standing on the precipice of a cliff. I stood over him for what felt like an eternity, my shadow stretching across his chest. The room smelt like him, that mix of salt, laundry detergent, and something deeper, something purely masculine. My breath was shallow, hitching in my throat as I watched the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. I should have felt disgusted with myself. I should have felt that sharp, biting sting of maternal instinct that reminds you of who you are in the family tree. But looking at Leo, all I felt was a crushing, tectonic loneliness that had been building inside me for a decade. Mark hadn't looked at me with genuine desire in years. Our intimacy had become a scheduled chore, a punctuary exchange of physical needs that left me feeling more empty than before we started. And here was Leo, raw and beautiful and completely unaware of the storm he'd stirred up in me. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and I didn't stop them. I touched the skin of his shoulder, just a ghost of a graze, but the contact felt like an electric shock that traveled straight to my core. He stirred, a low moan vibrating in his throat, and for a panicked second I thought about bolting. But he didn't wake up immediately. He just shifted, rolling onto his back, which only made the situation more precarious. The light from the hall hit his face, highlighting the stubble along his jaw and the long lashes of his closed eyes. He looked vulnerable, but there was a power in that vulnerability that held me captive. I found myself sitting on the edge of the mattress, the springs give way slightly under my weight. My heart was beating so hard I was sure it would wake the entire neighborhood. I was a professional woman, a woman of standing in my community, and here I was, hovering over my nephew like a predator or a devotee. The line wasn't just blurred, it had been completely erased. Then his eyes opened. There was no slow transition from sleep to wakefulness. One moment he was out, and the next he was staring directly at me, his pupils blown wide in the dim light. I froze, my hand still resting near his collarbone. We stayed like that for a long, agonizing minute, the only sound the mechanical drone of the air conditioner. I expected him to jump back, to look at me with horror, to ask me what the hell I was doing in his room in the middle of the night. But he didn't. He didn't move a muscle. He just watched me with an intensity that made the air feel like it was vibrating. "Chloe?" he whispered, his voice thick with sleep and something else I couldn't quite name. He didn't say Aunt Chloe. He just said my name. I came to check the AC, I stammered, the lie sounding pathetic and hollow even to my own ears. I started to stand up, my face burning with a shame that was finally starting to catch up to me. But before I could retreat, his hand shot out and gripped my wrist. His grip wasn't aggressive, but it was firm, a tether that pinned me to the spot. His skin was hot, burning against mine. He didn't let go, and he didn't look away. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy with all the things we hadn't said over the last few weeks. The lingering glances at the dinner table, the accidental touches in the kitchen, the way we both stayed up late just to be in the same room. "You're shaking," he said softly, his thumb tracing the delicate skin of my inner wrist. It was an intimate gesture, one that shattered whatever remained of my resolve. I looked down at his hand, then back up at his face, and the dam finally broke. All the frustration, the neglect from Mark, the feeling of being invisible, and the strange magnetic pull I felt toward this boy, this man, collided in my chest. I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned closer, drawn in by the gravity of the moment. "I should go, Leo," I whispered, though I made no move to leave. "This is crazy. This is wrong. You know it's wrong." "Is it?" he asked, his voice dropping to a register that made my knees weak. He sat up slowly, never letting go of my wrist, until we were eye to level. The proximity was overwhelming. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the sleep on his breath. "Because I've been sitting in this house for 3 weeks watching you disappear. I've been watching you wait for a man who doesn't even see you when you're standing right in front of him. I see you, Chloe. I've seen you since the second I got here." He reached up with his free hand and tucked a damp strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my neck. The touch was so tender, so purposeful, that I felt a sob catch in my throat. I knew I was at a crossroads. One path led back to my cold, sterile bedroom and a life of quiet desperation with Mark. The other led into the unknown, a path paved with betrayal and a kind of chaos that could destroy everything I knew. But looking at Leo, I realized I was already destroyed. My marriage was a hollow shell. My identity was a mask, and for the first time in a decade, I felt something other than numb. I felt alive. It was a dangerous, volatile kind of life, but I craved it like oxygen. I leaned my forehead against his, closing my eyes, letting the scent of him fill my senses. "We can't," I breathed, the words more of a plea than a command. "We already are," he countered, his breath warm against my lips. He was right. The moment I stepped into this room, the moment I stayed, the betrayal had already begun. The physical act was just a formality at this point. The emotional infidelity had been brewing since that first hug in the driveway. He shifted closer. His hand moved from my neck to the small of my back, pulling me toward him until there was no space left between us. The towel I had wrapped around myself felt like a flimsy, ridiculous barrier.
I felt like a teenager again, reckless, impulsive, and terrified. But I also felt a surge of power I hadn't felt in years. I was being wanted, truly, deeply wanted. He didn't wait for me to make the first move. He leaned in and kissed me, a soft, tentative press of lips that quickly deepened into something hungry and desperate. It was a kiss that tasted of forbidden things, of summer heat and long suppressed desires. My hands found their way into his hair, pulling him closer, my fingers anchoring me to this moment of madness. Every rational thought, every moral compass I possessed was drowned out by the sheer, visceral reality of him. The world outside this room, Mark, the suburbs, my sister, my reputation, ceased to exist. There was only the sound of our breathing and the frantic beat of my heart against his chest. As the kiss intensified, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, a terrifying kind of peace.
I had spent so long trying to be perfect, trying to hold everything together, and it had only left me empty. In Leo's arms, I didn't have to be perfect. I just had to be. He pulled back for a second, his eyes searching mine one last time, giving me one final chance to run. I saw the question in his gaze, the silent acknowledgement of the bridge we were about to burn. I didn't pull away. I didn't say a word. I just reached for the hem of those gray sweatpants, my heart in my throat, and made the choice that would change the trajectory of my life forever. The heat of the Virginia night pressed in through the window, but it was nothing compared to the fire starting in that basement room. The silence that followed was heavy, not with regret yet, but with the sheer gravitational pull of what we were doing. Every touch felt like a lightning strike, searing away the layers of the suburban housewife I had spent a decade perfecting. Leo's hands were rougher than Mark's, his movements filled with a raw, unpolished hunger that made me feel like I was being seen for the first time in an eternity. There was no polite hesitation, no routine. In the dim, blue-tinted light of that basement guest room, the morality of the situation, the fact that he was my sister's son, that my husband was only a few miles away at a hotel, felt like a distant, fading radio signal. All that mattered was the friction of skin, the frantic heat of our breath, and the way he whispered my name against my collarbone like a prayer he wasn't supposed to say. When it finally happened, it wasn't the poetic, cinematic experience you see in movies. It was desperate. It was a collision of my midlife starvation and his youthful obsession. I felt a terrifying sense of liberation as I let go of the Aunt Chloe persona, shedding it like a skin that had become too tight. I was just a woman, and he was just a man, and the house around us felt like it was holding its breath, the walls absorbing the sounds of a betrayal that could never be unheard. For those hours, I didn't think about Sarah. I didn't think about the family barbecues or the holiday photos on the mantle. I only thought about the way Leo's fingers dug into my hips and the way he looked at me, not as a relative, not as an older woman, but as something essential. Afterward, the reality didn't crash in all at once. It leaked in through the cracks. We lay there in the tangled sheets, the sweat cooling on our skin as the air conditioner rattled in its frame. The hum of the machine suddenly sounded like a judging growl. Leo was staring at the ceiling, his chest still heaving slightly. I reached out to touch his arm, but for the first time, I felt a flicker of hesitation. The intimacy that had felt so natural moments ago now felt heavy, fraught with the weight of the sun that would eventually rise. "Chloe," he said, his voice cracking just a little. He turned his head to look at me, and in the shadows he looked so much younger. For a fleeting second, I saw the little boy who used to scrape his knees at family reunions, and a physical wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. "Don't," I whispered, sitting up and reaching for my towel. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from excitement. It was the onset of a cold, hard sobriety. I stood up, the floorboards cold beneath my feet, and tried to find my bearings in the dark. I looked back at him, and he looked lost, caught between the thrill of what we'd done and the realization of what it meant. He reached for me, his hand hovering in the air between us. "You don't have to run," he said, but the conviction was gone from his voice. We both knew I did. I had to run back to the life I'd just sabotaged, to the bedroom I shared with a man I was now deceiving in the most fundamental way possible. I slipped out of the room and climbed the stairs like a thief in my own home. Every creak of the wood felt like a gunshot. When I reached the master bedroom, I didn't turn on the lights. I crawled into the bed. Mark's side was empty, the sheets cold, and I stared at the digital clock on the nightstand. 3:14 a.m. In 4 hours, the sun would be up. In 12 hours, Mark would be home. I lay there, my skin still tingling from Leo's touch, and tried to reconcile the woman who had just been moaning in a basement with the woman who would have to make coffee and talk about the weather tomorrow. The guilt started as a small spark in my gut, growing into a bonfire that made it impossible to breathe. I had crossed a line that didn't just break a marriage, it fractured a family. The next morning was a blur of high-functioning dissociation. I was in the kitchen, the sun streaming through the windows, looking exactly like the woman I was supposed to be. I made a pot of coffee, the smell of the beans usually a comfort, but today it made me feel sick. I heard Leo's footsteps on the stairs, and my heart plummeted. When he walked into the kitchen, he looked like he hadn't slept a wink. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he wouldn't look at me directly. "Morning," he mumbled, reaching for a mug. His hand brushed mine as he reached for the sugar, and I jumped back as if I had been burned. The electricity was still there, but now it was laced with a toxic current of fear. "We can't do that again, Leo," I said, my voice low and sharp, barely a whisper. I was staring out the window at the neighbor's dog chasing a squirrel, my eyes burning. It was a mistake, a huge, terrible mistake. We have to forget it happened. I could feel him standing behind me, his presence a heavy weight in the small kitchen. I wanted him to agree, to tell me he understood, to give me some kind of exit ramp.
But the silence stretched on until it was unbearable. When I finally turned around, he wasn't looking at the floor anymore. He was looking at me with a frighteningly intense glare, his jaw set. "You really think you can just turn it off?" he asked, his voice shaking with a mix of hurt and anger. "You think you can go back to being Aunt Chloe after last night? I saw you, Chloe. I felt you. You weren't making a mistake then. You were finally being honest." His words hit me like a physical blow. The arrogance of youth, the way he thought he understood my soul because we'd shared a few hours of darkness. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he didn't know anything about the life I'd lived or the stakes I was playing with. But I couldn't, because a part of me knew he was right. I hadn't felt that honest in years.
Before I could respond, the sound of a garage door opening echoed through the house. We both froze. Mark was home early. The panic that surged through me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a pure, visceral fight or flight response. I looked at Leo, his eyes wide with the same terror, and for a second we were bonded again, not by desire, but by the shared threat of destruction. "Go to the backyard," I hissed, pointing toward the sliding glass door. "Act like you've been out there reading or something. Just go." He hesitated for a heartbeat, then bolted out the door just as the interior door from the garage swung open. Mark walked in, looking disheveled and tired from his trip, dropping his laptop bag on the kitchen island with a heavy thud. "Hey, babe," he said, leaning over to give me a peck on the cheek. I held my breath, certain he could smell Leo on me, certain he could see the marks on my neck that I hadn't even checked for in the mirror. He smelled like stale coffee and airport air, a familiar, safe scent that now felt like an indictment. Traffic was a nightmare. I just wanted to get home. He poured himself a cup of coffee, oblivious to the fact that the air in the room was still vibrating with the ghost of my infidelity. I stood there, nodding and smiling, playing the role of the dutiful wife while my mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios. I could see Leo through the kitchen window, sitting on the patio furniture, staring at nothing. Mark followed my gaze and waved at him through the glass. "Kid looks like he's adjusting well," Mark noted, taking a sip of his coffee. "Quiet. I like that. Not like some of those loudmouth punks his age." I felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat and had to bite my tongue to keep it down. If Mark only knew the quiet things his nephew had been doing in the basement, he wouldn't be standing there so calmly. The rest of the day was a slow-motion car crash. Every time Mark touched my arm or asked me a question, I felt like I was going to shatter. Leo stayed outside for hours, then retreated to the basement, avoiding us both. The tension was a living thing, a third person in the room that Mark was somehow blind to. But I knew this wasn't over. I could feel Leo's gaze on me even when he wasn't in the room. I could feel the secret we shared pulsating between us like a heartbeat. I had thought the act itself would be the climax, but as I sat at the dinner table that night, watching Mark eat his steak and talk about a new merger, I realized the real nightmare was just beginning. The betrayal wasn't a one-time event. It was a poison that was now coursing through the veins of my entire life. The following week was a masterclass in psychological torture. Mark was back to his routine, leaving for the office at 7 and returning at 6, completely oblivious to the radioactive decay of his own marriage. Leo, however, was no longer the quiet guest. He was a shadow that followed me from room to room. Every time Mark left, the air in the house changed. It became charged, heavy with the unspoken demand in Leo's eyes. He didn't have to say anything. The way he leaned against the doorframe while I folded laundry, or the way he'd linger in the hallway when I came out of the shower, said it all. He wasn't just a nephew anymore. He was a silent blackmailer of my heart, holding the memory of that night over me like a jagged blade. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. A thunderstorm was rolling in, the sky turning a bruised purple that mirrored my internal state. I was in the kitchen, frantically scrubbing a spot on the counter that didn't exist, just to keep my hands from shaking. Leo walked in, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. He didn't stop at the island this time. He walked right up behind me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "You can't keep doing this, Chloe," he whispered, his breath hot against the back of my neck. "You're dying inside. I see the way you look at him. You don't love him. You're just scared of the mess." I spun around, my heart hammering. "You have to leave, Leo. I'm calling Sarah. I'll tell her it's not working out, that you need to go home." My voice was shrill, desperate. I was pleading with him, not commanding him. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something truly dark in his expression. It wasn't just desire. It was a possessive, territorial anger. He reached out and gripped the edge of the counter on either side of me, pinning me in place. He was bigger than me, stronger, and in that moment, the power dynamic shifted entirely. I realized I wasn't the cool aunt in control of a situation. I was a woman who had handed a loaded gun to a boy who didn't know how to safety it. "Go ahead," he challenged, his face inches from mine. Tell her everything. Tell her what happened in the basement. Tell her how you looked at me. Tell her how you didn't stop me."
The words were like physical blows. The thought of Sarah, my little sister, the person who trusted me more than anyone, finding out what I'd done made the world tilt on its axis. I felt a wave of cold, paralyzing dread. He had me. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't a summer romance. It was a hostage situation. I had traded my integrity for a few hours of feeling alive, and now the bill was due. That evening, Mark came home earlier than usual, carrying a bouquet of lilies. It was our anniversary, a date I had completely, utterly forgotten. 12 years, babe, he said, smiling that tired, earnest smile that used to make me feel safe. I know things have been a bit quiet lately, but I want you to know I appreciate you. Everything you do for this family. He handed me the flowers, and the scent of them, cloying and sweet, made me want to gag. I looked past him and saw Leo standing at the top of the stairs, watching us. He didn't hide. He didn't look away. He just stood there, a silent witness to the lie I was living. Dinner was a slow-motion execution. Mark talked about our plans for the future, about maybe taking that trip to Tuscany we'd always talked about. He spoke with such hope, such mundane, suburban optimism, while I sat across from him, my stomach in knots. Every time I looked up, I caught Leo's gaze. He was eating calmly, watching me struggle, enjoying the spectacle of my unraveling. It was a game to him now. He had seen the cracks in the foundation, and he was curious to see how much weight it could take before it collapsed. I realized then that Leo wasn't the victim of a midlife crisis. He was the catalyst for a destruction I had been secretly craving for years. After dinner, Mark went to the den to finish some paperwork, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the dishes. Leo appeared beside me, picking up a towel to dry. "He's a good man, Chloe," Leo said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "He really is. Stable, reliable, boring as hell." He looked at me, and I saw a reflection of my own misery in his eyes. "But he doesn't know you. Not really. He loves the idea of you. I love the mess." He reached out and touched my hand, and despite the horror of it all, I didn't pull away. The shame was so deep now that it had become a part of me, a second skin I couldn't shed. I realized in that moment that there was no going back. The woman I was before Leo arrived was gone.
I had burned the bridge, and the fire was spreading to the rest of the forest. I looked at the kitchen, the granite countertops, the high-end appliances, the life I'd spent 12 years building, and it felt like a stage set. None of it was real. The only thing that was real was the suffocating weight of the secret and the terrifying magnetic pull of the boy standing next to me. I was trapped in a prison of my own making, and the only person with the key was the one who wanted to keep me there. That night, while Mark slept soundly beside me, dreaming of mergers and retirement accounts, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The storm had passed, leaving the air outside thick and humid once again. I heard the floorboards in the hallway creak. I knew it was Leo. I knew he was standing outside my bedroom door, waiting. He didn't knock. He didn't have to. The invitation was written in the silence of the house. I sat up, the silk of my nightgown sliding against my skin, and for a long time I just stayed there, caught between the life I had and the chaos I'd chosen. I thought about Sarah. I thought about the phone call I should have made a week ago. I thought about the look on Mark's face if he ever found out, the way his world would shatter, the way he would never be able to trust another human being as long as he lived. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. I was mourning the woman I used to be, the one who believed she was a good person. That woman was dead. She had died in a basement in the middle of a Virginia summer, and she wasn't coming back. Slowly, quietly, I slid out of bed. I didn't look at Mark. I didn't want to see his face. I walked toward the door, my heart heavy with a grief that surpassed anything I'd ever known. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling. I knew that once I opened this door, there would be no more secrets, only the slow, inevitable slide toward a total collapse. The betrayal was complete. I wasn't just cheating on my husband, I was cheating on my soul. I turned the knob, the click sounding like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. Leo was there, a shadow in the dark hallway, his eyes burning with a triumphant light. I stepped out of the room and closed the door behind me, leaving the remnants of my life in the dark.